What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
For as long as I can remember, my birthday has been the kind of day that slipped by almost unnoticed, the sort of date that barely earned a passing mention in conversation or a half-hearted gesture from my family. While my brother Daniel's birthdays were treated as grand milestones that demanded attention, celebration, and money, year after year without fail. When I was a kid, my birthdays were little more than pizza boxes stacked on the counter and maybe a cake from the grocery store. One of those with the generic icing flowers and my name spelled incorrectly, while Daniel's special day meant balloons, DJs, rented halls, custom cakes that looked like they belonged on television, and entire neighborhoods being invited to watch him bask in the spotlight that seemed permanently fixed above his head. I used to tell myself it didn't matter, that it was just one day, but when you're 12 and sitting in your room while everyone in the house is busy ironing outfits for your brother's party, the message you absorb is louder than any words. They don't see you, and they don't care to. I remember one year in particular when I turned 16. 16 is supposed to be a milestone, right? Sweet 16, the moment every girl looks forward to, the one time when you should feel like the world is ready to take you seriously, maybe even to celebrate your stepping into adulthood. That morning I came downstairs hoping for something, anything, a small gathering, a surprise, maybe even just a card that felt thoughtful. Instead, I found my parents rushing around to finalize the catering order for Daniel's 18th, which was still 2 weeks away. My mom brushed past me holding a clipboard, muttering about flower arrangements, and when I reminded her quietly that it was my birthday, she stopped for a split second, gave me a distracted smile, and said, "Oh honey, we'll do something later. But right now I'm in the middle of 1,000 things." There was no later. I spent the evening eating takeout with a friend who pitied me enough to drop by, and I promised myself that I would never forget how it felt to be invisible in my own home. The years rolled on and the pattern only grew more exaggerated. Daniel turned 21 and my parents rented out a private space downtown, complete with champagne toasts, speeches, and gifts that cost more than I earned in 6 months. Meanwhile, on my 21st, I was handed a $50 gift card tucked into an envelope without even a signature, the kind of thing you give a coworker when you forget their name at the holiday party. Everyone laughed when Daniel made a drunken speech about being the golden child, and my parents clapped as though he had spoken truth worth engraving into stone, while I sat at the edge of the room holding back the kind of bitterness that tastes sharp on the back of your tongue. Over time, I learned that calling out the difference, even quietly, was pointless. If I dared to mention it, my parents would sigh and tell me not to compare, that Daniel was more social, that he had more friends, that he deserved to be celebrated because he was special, as if my quieter personality somehow meant I didn't warrant joy or attention. Eventually, I stopped asking, stopped hinting, stopped waiting for a moment when they would suddenly recognize that I too wanted to feel important. I played along at the parties, smiled in the photos, even helped with setup and cleanup like some unpaid staff member, because what else could I do? Fighting for scraps of attention in a house that had already made its choice was like trying to scream into a void. But something shifted in me after I turned 25. That year, my parents and Daniel completely forgot my birthday, not just in the casual way they used to brush it aside, but entirely. There wasn't even a text or a perfunctory "happy birthday" at the dinner table. Instead, the whole family was consumed with planning Daniel's 30th bash, which involved a rented yacht and a guest list that looked like the cast of a reality TV show. I sat at my desk at work that day, staring at a stack of emails, when it hit me with startling clarity that this wasn't going to change. They weren't suddenly going to wake up one year and realize how cruel it was to dismiss me over and over. If I wanted recognition, if I wanted a celebration that mattered, I would have to build it myself, not by begging them to care, but by quietly outgrowing their narrow vision of me. That night, I went home, poured myself a glass of wine, and wrote in my journal that I would never again waste energy pointing out their favoritism. Instead, I would let them keep underestimating me. I would smile, nod, and appear unbothered, all while working towards something they couldn't even imagine. It wasn't a dramatic vow of revenge at first. It was more of a private pact with myself, a way of reclaiming power after years of feeling small. But over time, the silence I practiced became sharper, more intentional. I realized that every overlooked birthday was fuel, every dismissive shrug a spark, and together they were building into something bigger than the parties Daniel loved so much. And so, while my parents kept clapping for my brother's speeches and cheering his every step, I kept my mouth shut, saved my strength, and invested my energy in a plan I would never share with them until the time was right. They thought I had accepted my place in the family hierarchy, that I had resigned myself to being background noise in Daniel's show, but what they didn't know was that I had stopped playing their game entirely. One day, I told myself they would learn that being ignored had its consequences. One day, the silence they had forced on me would be the loudest thing they had ever heard. After the year when everyone breezed past my birthday as if it were a parking meter that had already expired, I stopped waiting for apologies and started treating the blank space where a celebration should have been like a ledger entry that I intended to balance. Not with fireworks or speeches, but with work that would outlast every rented hall my parents loved throwing money at. So I built a life in the hours no one watched, the early mornings when the house was quiet and the late nights when the inbox thinned, and I learned to turn invisible into focused, to turn overlooked into disciplined, and to treat every shrug from my mother and every smirk from my father as a little deposit into a fund I would one day withdraw with interest. I took the project nobody wanted at the office because it required travel to unglamorous places and too many spreadsheets. I said yes to a short contract on the weekends that paid better than it looked on paper, and I spent long dinners listening to colleagues complain about bosses while quietly asking for additional responsibilities that piled up into a promotion with a title that sounded modest, but came with a performance bonus that, if I kept my mouth shut and my spending pared back to the bone, would front-load a future no one in my family expected me to have. At home, I moved with the same economy I brought to my budget because my apartment, with its light falling through the blinds in the late afternoon, felt like a training ground where every choice connected to a larger plan. So I learned that cooking on Sundays saved a small fortune and that packing lunches was not a sign of failure but of foresight, and I let my wardrobe stay simple while my savings grew heavier, a quiet heft that I carried like a secret medal inside my coat pocket. I opened accounts with dull names and automatic transfers, set reminders that chimed like small victories, and when I saw friends make purchases that sparkled and faded, I reminded myself that my victories would not be posted as stories or pinned on a board. They would arrive in one decisive move that no one would see coming. Family life, meanwhile, continued in its old theater, with my mother auditioning as a cruise director and my father as chief financier, and Daniel as their leading man who always required a bigger stage, which meant the next act was a housewarming that he declared would be the start of his grown-up era, a phrase he used with such confidence you might have mistaken it for a new law, not a preference. Over dinner my parents mentioned, with the ease of people who assume their choices are sensible, that they had helped Daniel get situated, because real estate was hard for young people, and while they were proud that I had learned to be independent, they hoped I understood that Daniel needed a little lift to get started, which floated through the air like one of those helium balloons that deflates overnight into a rubber raisin, except this one had a price tag attached that could have funded a dozen of my forgotten birthdays. I stirred my coffee and said I was happy for him, because there was nothing to gain by arguing with a decision that had been made long before I was old enough to notice it. If they wanted a show, I would give them one that looked sweet from the front row and sharp from the back, so when Daniel asked me, with the magnanimity of a man who believes he is doing you a favor, to use my creativity for a keepsake he could display at the new place, I smiled and offered to produce a photo book that would capture our family story, which delighted my mother because she adores anything that flatters the narrative she has told herself for decades. I spent a week combing through old photos, the grainy snapshots and the staged portraits, and I laid them out across pages in a timeline that started with our childhood and marched toward the present, and for Daniel's big milestones I gave them the generous spreads they loved. The tuxedo at prom, the team trophy, the graduation cap, the smiling group on the rented yacht, all framed with small captions that sounded affectionate and looked perfect on a coffee table. For my entries, I used ordinary pictures because that is the material I was given: the unremarkable cakes, the quick hugs in the kitchen, the pizza nights where I held the camera, and then, at the dates where my birthdays should have appeared, I left a full blank page with a neat line of text at the bottom that read, "Reserved for when it mattered," a caption that would look innocuous to a stranger and unavoidable to anyone who had lived in our house. I handed the finished book to Daniel at his pre-party brunch, smiled while he flipped through it, and watched his eyebrows pull together when he hit the first empty page, then the second, then the third. And by the time he reached the most recent year, the table had fallen quiet except for the tiny clink of my mother setting down her fork, because she had finally arrived at the uncomfortable realization that photographs do not lie and that timelines, when kept honest, insist on telling the truth, with or without your permission. Daniel tried to joke about minimalist design. My father cleared his throat and asked if I had missed some photos, and I took a slow breath that tasted like justice and told them gently that I had included everything I could find, that I hoped the book would inspire new memories, and that I was sure the next edition would be fuller if everyone wanted it to be. It was a small revenge, almost polite, but the way the air changed in that room felt like someone had cracked a window in a house that had been stuffy for far too long, and for once I watched them look not at Daniel, but at me, as if I had said something that could not be smoothed over with a bigger cake. Later that night, when the family group chat began buzzing with logistics about floral centerpieces and valet options for the housewarming, an email slid into my inbox with the subject line that I had been working toward in silence for years. A pre-approval that reflected every early morning and every quiet yes I had given to work that bored other people, and as I stared at the number that would translate into a set of keys and a front door with my name on it, I felt a calm that no party had ever produced, the calm of a plan clicking into place. I typed a note to a realtor about a property near the water that I had been eyeing like a secret, hit send, and looked up at the blinking cursor in the family chat where Daniel was polling everyone about signature cocktails. Then I closed the thread without responding and whispered to the empty room that I had my own RSVP to deliver. One they would receive not as an invitation, but as a shock, which is when the realtor replied faster than I expected and asked if I could make a viewing on the same Saturday my parents had chosen for Daniel's big event, a conflict that felt less like an accident and more like a door finally opening onto a different hallway, one I intended to walk down without asking anyone's permission. The week after the pre-party brunch, when the photo book had done its gentle damage and the house had finally admitted the draft of truth that slipped in through those blank pages, I threw myself into a rhythm that felt less like hustle and more like choreography. Because every motion, answering an email with precision, pushing back kindly but firmly in a negotiation, walking past the impulse aisle at the grocery store with my eyes straight ahead, clicked into a metronome I could trust, and inside that steady pace I allowed myself one private indulgence each evening, a late scroll through listings for places near the water where the streetlights looked soft and the porches were deep enough for long, quiet summers that belonged to me. I learned which listings were scams by the way the photos hid the corners. I learned which realtors told the truth because they were honest about the chipped paint and the older roof, and I learned to breathe through the terror that comes from realizing that if you do not advocate for your own future, there is no committee forming to do it for you. When the pre-approval arrived, it sat in my inbox like a letter you do not rush to open because reading it twice will not make it more real, and I took a screenshot to save in a tucked-away album on my phone labeled with a title that would mean nothing to anyone else. Then I made a spreadsheet that cross-checked taxes and insurance and those sneaky little fees that love to arrive when you are too in love with a porch swing to notice, and I watched the math settle into a shape that did not scare me. It made me feel taller, like I had finally grown into the shoes I bought for interviews years ago. Meanwhile, in the family chat, my mother posted mock-ups of a dessert table shaped like a skyline, and my father debated chair rentals as if a wrong choice could ruin a life, and Daniel announced that a friend from college who does music now would be curating the vibe, which made me smile into my coffee because there is a unique freedom in no longer auditioning for a role you never wanted. The realtor I liked, A sharp woman named Mariah who spoke in complete sentences and never tried to talk down to me, called early on a Wednesday to say that a place had just come back on the market after a deal fell through. A pale blue house with weathered steps and a line of scrub pines that guarded a path to the sand like old friends, and the owner wanted a clean, fast closing with a buyer who could keep their head. She offered a showing for Saturday morning, the same Saturday my parents had selected for Daniel's coronation-level housewarming, and there was a moment, brief and crystal clear, when the old version of me could have tried to make both happen. Could have scrambled into a dress after the showing, could have appeared breathless and apologetic, could have slipped back into the habit of smoothing every ripple so other people could float, but I let that version pass through me, and I heard my own voice, calm as a bank teller, say that Saturday morning would be perfect, that I would be there early, that I was serious and ready if the place was right. I still had to live my life in the hours in between, so I went to work and closed out a project that had hung around too long. I met with my manager and positioned myself for the second performance bonus in a row by laying out what the next quarter would look like if we were brave. And I turned down after-work drinks not because I disliked my colleagues, but because some goals are made of boredom endured with grace, and every dollar I did not spend brought the keys a half-step closer. My birthday crept up without fanfare again, quiet as a cat, and this time the family did not just delay any acknowledgement. They skipped it entirely in favor of obsessing over a fireworks permit for Daniel's milestone, which was pitched as a citywide spectacle even though the guest list would never fill a football field. I bought myself a slice of cake at a bakery that knows frosting is a serious matter, lit a candle at my kitchen counter with the overhead light off, and promised myself that if the house was right I would not hesitate just because it happened to be the same week I was, yet again, edited out of the family calendar. On Friday night, as the family group chat pinged with questions about where to set the bar and whether the playlist needed more songs that people over 40 would recognize, I sent a text that felt like a gift wrapped in politeness and lined with steel. A simple note saying I would be late to the event due to a previous commitment and to not hold the speeches on my account, which was true, and also a refusal to explain myself to people who had never considered my time important. A minute later, I sent Daniel a package tracking link for his present, a handsome walnut cheese board I had customized with a small engraving in the corner that read "Reserve space for what matters," a phrase he might read as inspirational and my mother might read as judgmental, which made it perfect. Saturday morning smelled like clean paper and cut lemons, my nervous system clicking between excitement and caution as I drove to the pale blue house with a binder of documents on the passenger seat like a second heart. And when I pulled up, the first thing I noticed was the way the porch columns looked patient and unluxurious, the kind of details that do not show well on glossy postcards but make you feel safe when the wind kicks up in January. Mariah greeted me with a nod that said she respected decisive people. We walked the rooms with a careful, unsentimental eye. We talked about the roof and the foundation and the unglamorous things that keep a house standing when the weather forgets to be gentle. And by the time we made it to the back steps and looked down the pine-lined path, the math and the desire had completed their handshake. I told her we should write the offer now, crisp and clean. No theater, no grand gestures. By noon the offer was out, by 2 the counter came back and we adjusted without blinking, and by late afternoon, while my parents were likely debating whether the napkins should match the fireworks, Mariah called to say the seller had accepted, that the inspection window was tight, that the earnest money would need to land fast, and that if I moved smartly I could close within a few weeks. I said yes to everything. I wired the earnest money with hands that did not shake, and I drove to the house one more time, parked across the street, and sat behind the wheel watching the porch take on that late light that makes ordinary paint look almost holy. Which is when my phone lit up with a string of messages from the family chat asking where I was, whether I had remembered the champagne flutes, whether I could run by the store because someone forgot extra limes, and I let the screen go dark because I had a different party to attend. My revenge that night was not loud or petty. It was the most adult thing I have ever done, because instead of standing next to a chocolate fountain making small talk with people who never looked me in the eye, I emailed the title company from my kitchen table and CC'd my manager on a note that locked the bonus payout timeline to my closing date. Then I printed the acceptance letter and slipped it into a plain folder, wrapped it with a ribbon I found in a drawer, and placed it inside a gift bag. With tissue paper, a simple package that I left on the entry table so I could grab it on my way to Daniel's event, which I still planned to attend for a single, strategic reason. I wanted to hand my mother a present she could not open in public without changing the temperature of the room. By the time Saturday evening arrived, Daniel's housewarming had already inflated into something that looked less like a family gathering and more like a carefully orchestrated parade, complete with a guest list full of people who cared less about him and more about free food and the opportunity to network around an open bar. I walked in later than expected, carrying a simple bag with the ribbon folder tucked neatly inside, and as I crossed the room with my quiet smile, I noticed how quickly the air shifted when people realized I was not just a shadow orbiting my brother's spotlight anymore. My mother's eyes lit up with the kind of relief that said she had worried I would not come at all. My father gave me a nod that was more approval than welcome, and Daniel, dressed in a shirt a little too shiny for his age, smirked as though he had won some unspoken contest simply by filling a room. I congratulated him warmly, hugged my mother with the kind of embrace that lasts 1 second too long, and slipped the gift bag into her hands before she could pass me another chore. They were not supposed to open presents until later, but my mother's curiosity got the better of her, and she tore through the tissue paper right there at the kitchen island, pulling out the folder with a frown that suggested she thought it was paperwork or a set of instructions for some DIY project. When she slid the document free and read the first lines, her face changed so abruptly that Daniel, mid-conversation about his sound system, broke off and leaned closer. The words "offer accepted" stretched across the page in official fonts, the kind of fonts that do not bend or apologize, and underneath was the address of the pale blue house with the weathered porch I had already begun to think of as mine. The silence that followed was almost comical, as if the music had been cut for a dramatic pause, and then my father asked in a low voice what exactly he was looking at. I told them, calmly and without theatrics, that I had purchased a vacation home by the water, that the deal had been finalized earlier that afternoon, and that I had wanted them to be among the first to know, which was technically true and also the sharpest blade I could twist with a straight face. The kitchen, which had moments before smelled of catered appetizers and sugary cocktails, suddenly felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves had leaned closer to hear the fallout. My mother stammered something about timing, Daniel asked how I could possibly afford it without their help, and my father shifted into the posture of a man trying to solve a riddle with too many missing clues. Guests who had wandered nearby pretended not to listen, but failed miserably, their eyes darting between my brother's growing flush and my calm expression. I shrugged lightly, said I had been working hard, that I had saved, that bonuses and patience could build more than parties ever could, and I sipped my drink while my brother's jaw tightened in a way that almost made me laugh out loud. The rest of the night dissolved into a strange blend of forced merriment and tense whispers. My mother kept pulling me aside, asking questions she dressed up as casual, but which carried the frantic energy of someone desperate to reassert control. My father dropped hints about investments, about how families should share their resources, and Daniel sulked in the corner with friends who did not know how to comfort him without risking their place at his bar. I floated through it all like a guest at someone else's play, amused by how quickly the roles had shifted, how the applause that usually rang for him now sputtered into uneasy murmurs aimed in my direction. When I left, slipping out before dessert was served, my phone vibrated nonstop with calls and texts, each one a different shade of disbelief. Daniel accused me of blindsiding the family, my mother begged me to explain how I had kept such a thing secret, and my father left a voicemail that started calm and ended with a warning tone I had not heard since childhood. I drove home with the windows cracked, the night air cool against my skin, and for the first time in years I felt no weight pressing down on my chest. Their frenzy was the celebration I had always been denied, their confusion the cake I had baked myself, and the best part was that I had not shouted, had not demanded, had not even asked for recognition. I had simply let the truth walk into the room wearing my name, and it had done the work for me. As I set the folder on my own kitchen counter, lit only by the glow of a single lamp, my phone buzzed again with a new voicemail from my mother, her voice shaking as she said, "Jessica, we need to talk. This isn't funny." I poured myself a glass of wine, leaned back in the chair, and let her words hang in the air like smoke that never finds a window. For once, they were the ones asking for my attention, the ones demanding an explanation, and I was the one holding the silence they could not ignore. The morning after the party, I woke before the sun, not because anxiety had shaken me out of sleep the way it used to after family events, but because the thought of the pale blue house breathing quietly by the water pulled me out of bed with a calm that felt like certainty, and as the sky shifted from graphite to pearl, I brewed coffee, opened the blinds, and began sorting through the swarm of messages that had stacked themselves into a judgmental column on my phone, each one a variation on surprise, accusation, or the trembling demand for an explanation that arrives when people who have always enjoyed first refusal on your attention suddenly find the line engaged. Daniel had left a voice memo that sounded like a monologue he wished he had delivered into a microphone, complaining that the spotlight had been stolen and that the optics were hostile. My father had written 3 separate paragraphs about family unity and transparency and how major financial decisions should be workshopped together, and my mother had sent a series of questions without punctuation, which made them read like confessions, asking whether I was in trouble, whether someone had pressured me, whether I was being reckless, whether she had missed a sign I had been waving for years. I read them all. Then I did something that felt like adult mischief rather than spite, because I opened the photo album on my phone, chose 6 images from the afternoon before, the porch, the key in my hand, the ocean caught between pines, the tiny brass numbers over the door, the inspection report folded like a paper crane, and, for good measure, a single candle balanced on a bakery slice with wax just beginning to spill, and I dropped them into the family thread with one sentence that would give them no handle to grab, celebrated last night, which sounded both gentle and impenetrable, the conversational equivalent of a door that closes without slamming. I drove to the house with a box of practical things: sponges, a hammer, a tape measure, a roll of blue painter's tape that made me feel like a person who plans, and I walked the rooms as if I were learning a language I had always understood but never spoken out loud. Marking the wall where a simple shelf would hold borrowed paperbacks, measuring the window where a shade should filter the coastal glare into something kind, and letting myself picture, not the grand holidays my family would attempt to colonize, but the small, private days that build a life, the Tuesdays when all you need is a clean mug and a chair that does not wobble. At noon, when the checklists were done and the echoes had started to sound like company rather than emptiness, I sat on the back steps with a notebook and drew up a plan that looked suspiciously like revenge disguised as etiquette. Because I decided that I would not argue with anyone on the phone, I would not write essays defending a purchase that harmed no one, and I would not attend any meeting called to clear the air, but I would send a package that told the truth with a smile sharp enough to leave a mark. By late afternoon, I had assembled 3 identical boxes lined with plain tissue and closed with the same ribbon from my kitchen drawer, and inside each one I placed a copy of the photo book I had made for Daniel, a second edition whose layout mirrored the first exactly except for one quiet change that would do its work without a single raised voice. Because in the spots where those blank pages had once stood like accidents or oversights, I now printed full-bleed photographs of the pale blue house on the day the offer was accepted, and beneath each image I added a caption in the same tidy font as before, reserved for when it mattered, which turned the book from a family scrapbook into a mirror. And then I tucked into each box a thin envelope containing a calendar printout for the coming year with 4 weekends shaded in soft gray, the days I planned to protect with the same fierceness my parents had always reserved for Daniel's galas. And at the bottom I wrote one line that made me laugh as I sealed the flap: "Please RSVP if you'd like to visit. Advance notice required. No fireworks permits necessary." The courier picked up the boxes before dinner, and not long after the door shut behind him, my mother called with the speed of someone who had opened a package in the foyer and decided that waiting to sit down would take too long, her voice moving through hope, anger, and a kind of wounded nostalgia so quickly that I had to hold the phone away for a second to find my balance. And she asked if I had done this to hurt them, if I could have told them earlier, if I understood how humiliated Daniel felt, which was a question that almost drew from me the old reflexive apology, the automatic smoothing that had kept me pliant for too long. But instead I said that I had done this to stop hurting myself, that I had given them more birthdays than I could afford, and that if embarrassment was the first step toward honesty, then maybe it was a gift we should pass around. And then I told her, as kindly as I could, that I would not be coming over to relitigate decades in a single afternoon, that I needed quiet, and that if she wanted to see the place she could pick one of the shaded weekends, and I would show her the porch where the wind carries the smell of salt at dusk. The next day, Daniel posted a public message about loyalty that read like a subtweet with a tuxedo on. Friends sent me congratulations that doubled as apologies for the years they had watched without intervening. And my father left a single text that remembered his old authority, but softened it into a question. "Are you sure this is the way you want to do things?" To which I replied with the only answer that mattered, yes. And then I turned my attention back to the house because the inspector arrived with a list of fixes, and I preferred the honest difficulty of caulk and screws to the theatrical difficulty of family politics. In the evening, as a gray strip of weather crossed the water and the porch light made the brass numbers glow, I took one last photograph with the timer and printed it on plain paper, then slid it into a simple frame on the mantel. A quiet declaration that this room now had a memory that did not require permission. For my last act, the small, witty revenge that tasted cleaner than anything I had imagined during those quiet, hurt birthdays, I set up a shared photo album labeled not with my name or the address, but with the phrase that had followed me from the caption to the engraving and back again, reserved for when it matters, and I added exactly 12 images. One for each of the years I had let myself be erased. Then I toggled comments off, disabled downloads, and shared the link with the family thread. And no one else, attaching only a single sentence that did not beg or taunt. "If you'd like to see more, you'll have to come in person." The thread lit up and then fell still, as if everyone had simultaneously decided to breathe through it, and I set the phone face down because for once the choice belonged entirely to me. Weeks later, when the boxes had been opened and the shaded weekends approached without a single RSVP, a letter arrived in my mailbox with my mother's handwriting pressed hard into the envelope, as if force could make ink behave. And I carried it inside and set it next to the bowl where I toss my keys. Then I made tea and stood at the window while the light softened across the floor, telling myself that boundaries are not doors slamming but thresholds chosen, and I left the letter unopened until the water cooled, until the room settled, until I could decide whether reading it would be an act of kindness or a step backward, and when I finally sat down I lifted the flap slowly. Not to prolong drama, but to honor the feeling that I had earned the right to take my time, and just before my eyes found the first line I set it down again, because the knock at the door startled me into a stillness I had not felt since childhood. And through the glass I saw a figure I could not yet place, a shadow between what had been and what could be, and I told myself I would open one of them, the letter or the door, but not both at once, because some answers, even the ones you have chased for years, are best taken one at a time, and the rest, for now, could remain reserved for when it truly mattered.